Welcome to the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival, one of the world's largest and oldest Jewish cultural arts events. We want to thank all of our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, and all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, SAGE, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, for their continued support throughout all of these years. My name is Elizabeth Schwartz, and I'm thrilled to be moderating a virtual conversation with the mighty Ira Glasser, the executive director for 23 years of the ACLU, and the director and producer, Nico Perrino, from the film Mighty Ira, which is premiering at this year's festival. So Ira, Nico, thank you all for joining us. We really are grateful for you being here. We're grateful for our audience showing up. I have to just full disclosure say that I've been a card-carrying member of the ACLU for really as long as I can remember. I co-counseled on one of Florida's gay adoption cases with the ACLU's, what was then known as the Gay and Lesbian Rights Project. So again, I'm just sort of fangirling out here, really thrilled to be with you guys. This was an incredible film. You got in Jackie Robinson, Skokie, your like crazy friendship with William F. Buckley, Ben Stern, Nora Siegel, Philippa Strong, David Goldberger. First, I want to ask Ira, and then I want to ask Nico. Like, what did you leave out? Like, what did you wish you had more time for?
Well, when I was at the ACLU and people would ask me what were the most important things we were doing at the moment, I would always smile and say, we always feel like we're fighting a 12-front war. And one of the glorious things about being at the ACLU was the opportunity to be involved in so many issues. We were not a single issue organization. And at any given moment, I could be involved in 20 or 30 different issues and different important cases. So when Nico first approached me about doing this film, the very first thing I said was, we're going to have to leave almost everything out. This is not War and Peace. We haven't gotten, 1,000 pages to write here. And so anything that you do about the important issues is going to have to be selective. And so the answer to what was left out is almost everything. And what but the fact is that free speech and racial justice were two of the most consistent and abiding and consequential issues throughout the decades that I was at the ACLU. And if one had to pick two issues, those would be the ones I would pick, and it would take too long to even catalog all the ones that could be included that were not, but they had to be excluded, obviously for reasons of space and time.
Yeah, well, the impetus for this movie kind of began in 2017 when I met Ira at the funeral for Nat Hentoff, who was a longtime columnist for the Village Voice, and the subject of a documentary I loved that came out in 2015, 16, somewhere around there. No, maybe even earlier, called The Pleasures of Being Out of Step, which was about Nat Hentoff's life. And I had known Nat Hentoff because of his First Amendment advocacy, and I had hosted a podcast I still host a podcast called, So to Speak, the Free Speech Podcast. And after meeting Ira, I invited him on the show to discuss those issues. And Ira said that it would be a short conversation because it's been 20 or some odd years since he was in the thick of these issues and he might not remember much. And it was, 2-3 hours later that we were still talking. And it was after that conversation and the kind of profile of the conversation, it got a lot of press, that I approached my boss about making the documentary. And we used the outline of that podcast conversation as the outline for the film, more or less. We actually thought the film would be a short 13-minute kind of 60-minute style deal. But as we got deeper and deeper into the story and the fortuitous events surrounding it, including Ira meeting Holocaust survivor Ben Stern for the first time out near Berkeley, we decided we wanted to try our hand at a feature, which we had never done before. We knew nothing about it. And we stuck pretty closely to the podcast. I'd say the only thing we left out was the discussion of his First Amendment work in the campaign finance area, which is a little bit too wonky for a film in which you want to tell stories. So we got a lot in there, and I hope we weaved it together in a way that keeps people engaged.
You really did, and for those of us who sort of grew up in the sort of reverberating Skokie moment, it was fascinating to see all the footage. I think a lot of us activists understood very much that Skokie was that important dividing line, and you either were on ACLU's side on that, or you, as you said, Ira, or it threatened ACLU's existence because everyone was pulling, others were pulling away their support. And I think a lot of us understood, like, once you start drawing the line, where are you going to stop drawing the line? And what was fascinating, one of the things that was fascinating was I didn't realize that the march in Skokie never happened. It was sort of like this history lesson of like, wait, after all that, it never even happened, because it was the reverberation of all of the conflict. But I thought it was so fascinating the statement that was made on behalf of the ACLU by the Jewish business and professional people that included them saying that as Jews, they especially recognize the paramount importance of preserving the rights of free expression. And I did a screen grab of that because I was fascinated by that sentence, that Jews, we especially understand that the rights of individuals are inextricably linked to the rights of all, and honoring the ACLU for fighting in one of those battles. And I noticed that RBG was on the list of signers at the time as a professor of law at Columbia University. So how do you think now? I'm sure everyone is asking you this. How do you think now about the way in which January 6th and the freedom of expression is being really weaponized by the alt-right, by the sort of radical conservatives, by the now twice impeached former occupant of the White House? How do you see that?
Well, in the years I was at the ACLU, it was commonly believed that free speech was a minority concern, that one of the problems in America was that if you took a poll, most people didn't support the First Amendment. My view was always different. My experience at the ACLU was that everybody supported free speech so long as it was theirs and the speech of people they agreed with. And what nobody ever understood, really nobody, and including most of our clients, never understood, was that if you ever gave the government, any government, a state government, a city government, the federal government, the police, any government, even a public school, any agency of the government, if you ever gave any of them the power to ban speech that they didn't like, they would gain the power to ban any speech they didn't like. And the first target would never be the last. And that the people who had the most to fear were people who were outvoted, who were in the minority, whether they were Jews or Blacks or children, or minority political views or minority religious views, or atheists or gays, and even women who were not a numerical minority were always a political minority. So why it would ever be in the interest of anybody in those minorities to cede their own right to speak to somebody in the government was always a mystery to me. And what happened in the Skokie case was that became a tremendous opportunity for us to discuss that problem and to really confront people with that. When I would go into synagogues during that time to debate the Skokie case, I confronted at the beginning some of the most hostile audiences I ever had confronted, even though most of the people there were liberals and many of them were ACLU members. But when I asked them what government official they would be comfortable with in ceding the power to decide whether they could speak or not, would that be Nixon? Would that be Joe McCarthy? Would that be, to bring it up to the current, would that be Rudy Giuliani? Would that be Donald Trump? Everybody wants to ban speech that they hate, but what they don't often consider is that if you allow the government to ban speech that's hateful, it all depends on what you hate. And the speech that Donald Trump hates, and the speech that Rudy Giuliani hates, and the speech that Joe McCarthy hated, and the speech that Richard Nixon hated, was not the speech that you hate. And you are never going to be the one to decide. They are. So why you would want to cede your rights to them was a mystery to me. And when it was positioned that way, people had second thoughts, even in those hostile audiences where I went to debate the issues. So it's like the black students in the 90s in universities who wanted to have hate speech codes to ban racist speech. They imagined that they would be the ones to decide which speech was racist. But when I went to speak to those groups, I didn't give them lectures on the First Amendment that they might have heard in a law school. I told them that in the 60s, if hate speech codes had been enforced on college campuses, their most frequent target wouldn't have been David Duke, it would have been Malcolm X and Eldridge Cleaver. And that it's a dangerous thing for a minority or somebody unpopular to cede their rights to a government who doesn't like them.
It's funny you bring that up, Ira. One of the first speech code cases on college campuses was in the late 80s in Dovey, Michigan. And I believe an ACLU affiliate was involved, and it was a hate speech code created, for a lot of the reasons these codes are created. But the first two individuals the code was used against were two black students. So, it's often speech codes are often wielded in a way that they're not intended or they're not expected to be. And so you create that risk anytime you give the institution or the government that power.
A lot of our audience is very concerned about the BDS movement, about speech on campus that many equate to anti-Semitism. Is FIRE involved in these conversations? So FIRE, for folks who don't know, is the logo on Nico's shirt, and is the organization that Nico works for, and that Ira is on the advisory board. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And does work for on civil liberties, on especially free speech on college campuses. So it makes me wonder what your take is on this particular issue, Nico.
Well, as a general matter, we are not fans of academic boycotts because they tend to limit academic freedom and the exchange of ideas. But as a First Amendment matter, we do not like the BDS laws that have been passed in many states across the country that forbid universities to bring people to campus to speak and do other things if they are an advocate of the BDS movement. And for those who don't know, it's the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, which has been, those sorts of efforts have been applied to other countries, and most notably South Africa in the early 90s and late 80s, but now is advocated against Israel in certain circumstances, given its conflict with the Palestinians. We don't like the idea that you can't bring a speaker to campus because they advocate for that, because it's a restriction on viewpoint, just like it's a restriction on any other viewpoint. And they get around it, or some of these state laws try and get around it by saying, well, you're paying money to these individuals, they're independent contractors, and the law forbids hiring contractors who advocate for BDS. Well, I mean, in this case, they're advocating a policy position, and forbidding individuals who hold that policy position to speak on a campus is forbidding a certain viewpoint and viewpoint discrimination. And to the extent that these laws have been challenged, they've almost always lost. I believe there was just a recent case in Arizona where they've lost, and they lose on First Amendment grounds. It's predictable. So There is a movement to implement these laws. We are concerned about the threat that BDS has to academic freedom and the exchange of ideas across borders and across countries. But as a First Amendment matter, you shouldn't forbid people from advocating for it, just like you shouldn't forbid, Nazis from marching in Skokie or any other idea that you might find offensive or dangerous.
And so is the answer to have, as the answer was in Skokie, to respond to hateful speech, as you said, Ira, in a film review about Ben Stern, you said it's precisely the response contemplated by the First Amendment to respond to hateful speech, not by granting the government power to ban the speech, but by organizing more speech. So,
well, yeah, I mean, the thing, there are two things to remember about this with particular concern that the Jews would have about anti-Israel advocacy in general. One is that there was a real case in 1973 in Britain of the National Student Union deciding to ban hate speech and bigoted speech. And they all got together and they passed this rule that applied to all college campuses in Britain. And all the student groups on the left were for it, including the student group of Zionist kids that were enthusiastically for it, and they banned the hate speech. A few years later, the same National Student Union banned a Zionist speaker who had been invited by a group of Jewish students to speak on a college campus. And the grounds on which they banned him was that they believed that Zionism, what they said, was a form of racism. Now, there are people who believe that, and there are people who don't believe that. But the fact of the matter is that the people who don't believe it were not the ones who had the power to decide it. The student union by that time had shifted politically so that a majority of them believed that Zionism was a form of racism. And since they were already against racist speech, they banned the Zionist speech. And the Zionist students who had favored that law were trapped by it. That was a perfect case in point of how speech restrictions are like poison gas. It seems like it's a great weapon when you have your favorite target in sight, but then the wind shifts and it gets blown back on you and you're out of luck. The second thing to be said about the boycotts, it's always important not to keep your eye on the current target. The thing you always have to ask when there's a proposal to ban something is, what else will it ban besides this? Now, if you're going to ban boycotts or advocacy of boycotts, think about the things that have been boycotted in this country that most liberals and most Jews supported. Think about the great boycotts in the United Farm Workers in California. Everybody I knew in the world, everybody stopped buying grapes in those days. Well, what is that? That's an economic boycott. What is a labor union strike? It's an economic boycott. There were boycotts of stores in the South because they wouldn't employ Blacks. Civil rights organizations, the NAACP and others, organized boycotts. All of those were challenged and all of them were upheld by the Supreme Court as exercises protected by the First Amendment, advocacy of a certain cause. If you don't agree with it, you have to organize against it. You have to speak against it. But if you allow the government to prohibit boycotting of Israel products, then you have to be prepared to prohibit the boycotting of South African products. You have to be prepared to prohibit the boycotting of grapes. You have to be prepared to prohibit the boycotting of segregated stores in the South. And so if you're not prepared to do that, if you're not prepared to give the government the power to decide, then you gotta live with the unpleasantness and the insult of having what you like boycotted in order to protect your right to boycott things that you don't like. And there's no way out of that dilemma. Either you allow these things or you give Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani the power to decide it. And that is too dangerous, particularly for Jews, it seems to me, and particularly for Blacks. So the support, the opposition to bans in particular situations is too narrowly conceived. You have to ask yourself always, if I allow them to ban this, what else will they get the power to ban? And how will it affect me? And that is an analysis that doesn't come easily or by instinct to most people. Most people get caught up in the individual case. If you're going to permit the Nazis to speak, oh God, I hate Nazis. Yeah, but what you're really doing is giving the government the power to decide what speech to permit. The town of Skokie banned the Nazis, or tried to, by saying that nobody could demonstrate in military uniforms. That was the actual operational ordinance that they passed. Later, they used it to ban the Jewish war veterans from parading in Skokie. But nobody was thinking about that at the time. They weren't thinking about, oh my God, what power am I giving the government here? They were thinking about, I want to get rid of the Nazis. And that is always a short-sighted way, and a very often a self-destructive way of analyzing these particular bans.
Well, it's not a great way to decide how you feel about anything, right? I mean, I thought it was really powerful when Ben Stern, the Holocaust survivor from Skokie we've spoken about here, when he was on Donahue and he asked Attorney Goldberger, well, if you were a survivor, how would you feel? Which is, that's making it subjective, right? Not objective. Many fights I've gotten into with people about the death penalty, and they'll say, but what if your mother or wife got raped? It's like, that's not how you make law, right? It has to be objective, not subjective. So, I mean, it seems to be the wrong way to go about making policy. Tell me this, so we're talking about religion here. Now, Ira, my distinct sense is that the Brooklyn Dodgers was your religion, right? That Ebbets Field was your sanctuary. You mentioned that, that it was the only integrated public accommodation space in the country at that time. And I loved how you said in the film that your outrage came sort of less from principles, but more about what they were doing with Jackie Robinson, he was our guy. And that's how you developed this sort of outrage and this deep understanding of racial injustice. What role, if any, did being Jewish play in founding these principles, founding these sense of outrage?
Well, I grew up in a very traditional Jewish home. My mother kept kosher. We went to synagogue on all the holidays. My grandparents, who lived 2 blocks from us in Brooklyn, were Orthodox Jews, and I went to Hebrew school after public school. I hated it because it prevented me from being able to play ball for a few hours before it got dark. I got out of school at 3, and I had to be at Hebrew school at the synagogue at 4:30. By the time I came out in the middle of the winter, and it was dark, but I went 4 days a week for years and years and years. And so I grew up in a very traditional Jewish culture. And this was also during World War II. I mean, I was 7 years old when World War II ended. And so the war and what was going on with the Nazis was very much present in all of our lives and in my sense of consciousness as I was growing up. And above all, what I learned from that was that historically and right now in Germany, Jews were a persecuted minority, and that they would always be a minority. And because they were a minority, you couldn't even trust democracy. You couldn't even trust the vote because they would always be outvoted. And so what you had to believe in is that it was somehow wrong, that there were certain rights people had that the majority could not be allowed to take away, even by a vote. Not just by a king, not just by a dictator like Hitler or Stalin, but not even by a vote. Because if the majority of people in America, say, passed a law that made it a crime to eat kosher food, what would my grandparents do? And so the sensibility that I grew up with, that was part and parcel of being a Jew, was a sense that as a minority, you were vulnerable to the excesses of a majoritarian point of view. And that even in a democracy, you needed a protection beyond the vote. And as it turned out, those protections were listed in the Bill of Rights. Now, I didn't know about that when I was 7 years old and 8 years old and 10 years old, but I grew up with those sensibilities. And I also grew up, and that was probably because of my mother and other relatives. I grew up thinking that Jews were not unique, that this kind of principle applied to all minorities, and that in America, it was more predominantly a problem with respect to Black people than I ever experienced as a Jew. I mean, I lived in a neighborhood where you could walk 15 blocks in any direction from my apartment building and never find anybody who wasn't white and Jewish. So I had no sense of being in the minority in terms of my everyday life. But when the Robinson thing happened in 1947, when I was 9, I understood. I mean, it was like listening to the Dodger broadcaster broadcasting the baseball games on the radio. We didn't have television yet. That I first learned that when Robinson and the other Black players on the Dodgers traveled with the team to St. Louis to play the Cardinals, they were not allowed to eat in the same restaurants as the rest of the team or even stay in the same hotels as the rest of the team. They had to find places for them to stay with private people in the Black community because there was no places for them to stay because they were Black. And that's how I first learned about segregation in housing and segregation in public accommodations. I didn't learn about that in school. I didn't even learn about it at home. I learned about it by the Dodger broadcaster, Red Barber, who had a Southern Mississippi accent, because that's where he was from. And as you correctly said, I got angry about it because those are my guys. That was my team. What do you mean they can't stay in the same hotel? You know, and it was very personal for me. And so I early on came to understand that the persecution to which Jews were particularly vulnerable as a minority, and as an often hated minority, were no different than the persecutions to which Blacks were vulnerable as a hated minority, and that was true of really of any minority. It was true of political minorities. It was true of sexual minorities. And so it took on for me a kind of a generic hostility toward those kinds of violations that for which being Jewish became an example and not something that was unique. And that's eventually, what led me to find a home at the ACLU.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that trajectory. And yet some of the footage in the documentary was so incredible. I mean, I couldn't believe just some of the stuff that you got. Nico, tell us a little bit about what were some of the challenging parts of telling the story? In my mind, I was like, how did you get the rights to this? How did you get the rights to this? Like, or where did you find this stuff? What a research team do you have at the Fire?
Yeah, we don't really have a research team. There's 3 of us pretty much who made this film. we did hire an archival researcher at one point to help us secure the rights to it, but we didn't we learned as we went along. We knew we wanted to tell a documentary, story about Ira's life. And the biggest challenge, and you put your finger on it, it was the archival. I mean, we're telling a story about history, things that happened 50 years ago, 40 years ago. And we ended up having 550 lines of archival. So what most people who don't make films know is that, at a certain point, you need to put every little clip of archival footage that you have in a spreadsheet, secure the rights to most of that, have a lawyer review it, and then they write an opinion letter that you get insurance for the film. You can't put out a movie without insurance. So it's called errors and omissions insurance or media liability insurance. And that was the biggest challenge, was getting the rights to a lot of this footage. We went through ABC, NBC, CBS, and they have great researchers there and great metadata on their archival footage that allows you to put in some keywords, and they spit out a transcript, or at least descriptions of all the footage. And some archival houses are easier to work with than others. NBC has a great online platform. ABC, which is owned by Disney, is a little bit more difficult, and you need a few more permissions, and there are a few more steps, because doing anything with Disney requires that. And actually now independent filmmakers can't get footage from ABC that involves talent. They can only get B-roll, which is kind of like aesthetic environmental stuff, but we just missed the cut for that by like a couple of months. So you wouldn't have a lot of the good Ben Stern footage without us barely missing the cut there. So that was the biggest challenge, and that the film would have been out a year earlier if we didn't have to secure the rights to 550 lines of archival. And almost everything in the film we secured rights for. There's very little that we fair use, just to be on the safe side. And some of the most fortuitous moments in the film happened because we found it in archival houses related to the networks. We had no idea Ben Stern was in the audience during the Donahue appearance. We knew about Ira meeting Ben Stern, and I should say anyone who doesn't know Ben Stern's story should watch Near Normal Man, the short film made by his daughter, Charlene Stern. He survived 9 concentration camps, 2 death marches, just an extraordinary man. He turns 100 next September. But we had no idea it was in the audience when David Goldberger was defending the Skokie case. And then we see him there and we're like, holy cow. And he was in the ABC footage, surrounding the table when all the Jewish members of the community were congregating. So, I urge any independent filmmaker to really spend a lot of time searching archival footage and taking the time to do it. We probably only used 60 minutes in our 90-minute film of it. You probably have to go through 20 hours of it to find what you want, but sometimes you find the best bits from your stories. So it was a lot of fun to look through, and we hope people enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for sharing that anecdote. Lucky us that you just made that cutoff, and thanks for all the rabbit holes that you all went down. That's fascinating that Ben Stern just showed up in the Donahue audience with that question that I found really interesting and powerful, and on some level problematic, as I said, about in terms of policymaking. He's what an amazing character he is. I read a story about him that he is now living with the granddaughter of a Nazi.
Yes.
Right? Isn't that? Does one of you want to tell that story? Because I think it's really fantastic, interesting. Sort of speaks to for example, your interesting friendship with William F. Buckley. How like RBG and Justice Scalia and these interesting alliances and what they produce. So please share.
Well, I don't really know too much about the story. Ben lives independently, even at his age, in his own home, a short distance from where his daughter lives in Berkeley. And he lived there with his wife until a couple of years ago. And she began to develop dementia in her mid-90s, and he found a place for her, a residential place for her to be that was within walking distance of his house, so he could go there every day. Now, when he says walking distance, the man is almost 100 years old. Walking distance is like a mile or two, and he just walks every day back and forth. That's what he does. And she died, I think, last year finally. So he lives alone, and he's in remarkably good shape for a man his age, but he can hardly hear, he can hardly see, and there are concerns with. So eventually, they find his daughter finds somebody to stay with him at least part of the time. I don't know all the details, and it turns out that this is the granddaughter of some guy who was a member of the Nazi Party during World War II. And the story becomes public, and Ben Stern is this avenging angel. I mean, he fought fiercely against the ACLU for defending the right of the neo-Nazis to march in Skokie, and he is a pugnacious, tough, unapologetically angry about, as who wouldn't be, about what happened to him and his family, and yet, he accommodates this young woman and becomes friends with her and becomes close to her, because the thing that's remarkable about him is that he never lets the abstract issues that he feels passionately about interfere with his humanity in his relationships with individual people. And so for him, it was simply not a problem that this young woman had an ancestor who who he had to have hated if he, and the same thing happened with me. I had never met him. He had never met me. I had spoken with his daughter a lot, and when she invited me out there to a showing at Berkeley of the documentary film she made about her father, which I had seen, she had sent me a video of it, and I had written a short review of it, and she invited me out there to be on a panel with him at Berkeley to discuss her documentary of the father. She picks me up, and I go from the airport to some place at the university, and she picks me up, and that's when I meet Ben Stern, and he's with her in the car, and I come walking up the car, and he opens the door of the passenger seat, gets out, and he looks up at me. I think maybe he's 5'3" or 5'4", but he's a very pugnacious personality. He looks up at me, sticks out his hand. Those were in the days when you still could shake hands. And he shakes my hand and he says, "We're not going to agree, but we're going to be friends." Oh. And he says this to me with that, angry firmness in his voice. And that's who he is. I mean, he's a guy who has, in a way, in the same way that Mandela did, went through unimaginable personal torture and emerged angry and committed to fight against it, to fight against what happened to him. But he emerged with his humanity intact and with a kind of a gentleness and a sweetness toward individual people, regardless of whether he agreed or didn't agree with what they thought. And it's an extraordinarily beautiful quality, and it's the nicest and best thing about him, more so than the courage it took for him to survive what he endured.
And an interesting postscript is that the German gal that's living with him is now a Judaic studies major. So there you go. You see how things end up turning out, right?
Right.
I love the moment that you had on screen with him, where he kissed you and said he was proud of you. That was really
it was amazing. I had, as you can imagine, 3,000 debates with people about Skokie over the years, and many of them with Jews who regarded me as a betrayal of Jewish values and so forth, and so I had no idea what to expect. But that was just a touchingly beautiful. And, you know, we spent about 2 hours in the kitchen of his daughter's house the day before that panel discussion, talking for 2 hours with each other about this issue and debating it. And he never gave an inch in his position.
I was going to say, did he come around at all? No, he never did.
No, and I never gave an inch. But I think what happened is that I think he understood, despite all the emotional burden of having lived through what he lived through, a burden that I could hardly even imagine. Despite that, I think he understood that in the context of the United States, not in the context of Germany in the 30s, but in the context of the United States, that his protection had some connection with the ability to protect the people he hated. I think there was a degree to which he understood that. He never said so explicitly. He never changed his position of resistance. But I think he understood at the end that the answer to the neo-Nazis coming to Skokie was not to ban them, but to out-organize them. And that's what he did. And he also understood that the town fathers, the government in Skokie, tried to ban the Nazis, but they also told him to go inside the house and shut the window shades and just be quiet. And he said, no. He says, I tried that once before. That doesn't work. No, I'm not doing that. And so he understood that the urge to ban the Nazis that the government of Skokie was doing was part and parcel of their urge to ban him from responding to the Nazis. What they wanted was for everybody to be quiet. And what he did come to understand is that that's a disaster. Yeah. That was the advice that the Jews got in Poland. Yeah. Just be quiet, this will pass. Yeah. Instead of struggle against it. And of course, in Germany, Poland, and Eastern Europe in those days, there was no First Amendment. There was no federal court system, independent court system to guarantee people's rights. You couldn't do what we do in America. But he did come to understand, I think, that at least here, at this time, in this place, and with the help of organizations like the ACLU and the NAACP and others, you do have certain rights and you can go into court to protect those rights, and that's really your protection. And that one of the rights you have is the right to organize a counter demonstration. And he organized 60,000 people to come to Skokie to demonstrate against the 12 neo-Nazis, and that's why they never came. You know, they you know, and then they went to Chicago, which is where they were from, and the same thing happened, and they were overwhelmed.
That footage was fantastic. It's pathetic. It's pathetic. You can't even see us. The poor Nazis, so put upon. You can't even see us. And I think you brought out really well in the documentary that it's also, I mean, not only is it of course about the marketplace of ideas, but there also have to be sufficient show of force from the police that you said have to be good enough and competent enough, you know, to protect folks. And your inclusion of the Charlottesville moment, Nico, I thought was really so. I found myself watching it thinking, how I hope this covers Charlottesville, because that was clearly a police fail. And you're getting Heather Heyer's mom, who, for those who don't remember, was the person who was run down in a car by one of the neo-Nazis at white supremacists in Charlottesville, and Heather Heyer's mom saying she was for free speech. I mean, this is someone who it couldn't be more personal than for her. So I mean, tell us a little bit, Nico, about including, getting that Charlottesville moment in there. I'm sure you wish you could have included some January 6th and some police failings there. You know, maybe do some DVD extras or something. But tell us how that fit into the story for you, and how when you maybe you found her some of her footage and we're like, bingo.
Yeah, well, I mean, just a moment on Susan Bro, who's Heather Heyer's mother. I mean, it's not just that she supported free speech in the abstract. She was questioned and asked, would you support, again, the right of the white
Right.
nationalists or the alt-right members to march in Charlottesville?
Right.
This is
Again, once
after
it
her
became personal
daughter-
for her, would you support? Yeah.
Yeah, and this was her daughter who was murdered during, the aftermath of that demonstration, and she said yes. And she said, I know this is going to be hard for people to hear, but she makes the same argument ultimately that Ira makes. It's like, who's going to decide? And at that time, it was Donald Trump and his administration, or if it was in the South, it would have been, your local racist mayor. So, yeah, Charlottesville, as David Goldberger, who was the lead attorney in the Skokie case, noted, had a lot of parallels with what was happening in Skokie. And one of the first things we in the free speech community got after Charlottesville was that this was a failure of the First Amendment, and the First Amendment was to blame for it. But if you look at the footage, the police did nothing. I mean, this isn't the first time in American history where two sides who hate each other or vehemently disagree are going to come in close contact, and there's the potential for violence. But the police need to be knowledgeable enough and prepared enough and show enough force to prevent that violence from happening. And that just didn't occur. Anyone who watches the documentary will just see, and there's not a police officer in sight. You have people in full combat gear with sticks and weapons and bottles just going right at each other. There's no police officer anywhere. And that's why we, in the film, showed the footage from Skokie where you have a barricade of police officers. They almost outnumber the demonstrators. And then you have Charlottesville, and you don't even see a single one. And of course, violence is going to ensue in those circumstances. So, and I interviewed a number of former First Amendment attorneys and advocates, and it's not just Ira. And to a person, they said, this was a police failure. This wasn't a failure of the First Amendment. But and there, you asked about the stuff that we couldn't include in the film. I wanted to get into a little bit of the debates in the aftermath of Charlottesville, particularly from students. Claire Gastignaglia, who was, I believe, the executive director of the ACLU of Virginia, which came to the defense of the alt-right in Charlottesville to demonstrate near the Robert E. Lee statue, gave a speech at William and Mary in the aftermath, and she was shouted down and prevented from speaking. And the students who shouted down and prevented her from speaking said, ACLU, you defend Nazis too. The Constitution will not survive the revolution. And there was originally about 20 minutes where we get into the generational divide that exists surrounding free speech, but we ended up cutting it because we feel like we were going on too much of a tangent, and we wanted to keep the film near 90 minutes. But that's definitely something that we saw in the aftermath of Charlottesville, and we did some public opinion polling, generational public opinion polling that bore it out. So, I guess it remains to be seen exactly how that memory of that event will affect people's support from the principles that, Ira and I advocate for.
Does anything, I mean, so when you say generational divide, it makes me, of course, think of social media and the kind of uneven playing ground sometimes that can happen when there's just these crazy blasts of mistruth and it's not the John Stuart Mill marketplace of ideas anymore. It's really, folks have like a much bigger sort of megaphone when they, pay to boost tweets or have bots, Russian bots, and all these sort of crazy things. Does that change the calculus at all? No.
Well,
No.
I don't see how it can. I grew up at a time when there was not only no social media, there was no internet. You talk to somebody 20 years old today and tell them there was a time when there was no internet, and then you follow it up by saying there was no television. They think you stepped out from the dinosaur age. But the fact of the matter is that I grew up at a time when you had 3 networks that controlled all the radio and later the televisions, and a few major newspapers. You had the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Hearst chain, and that was basically it. And so there was no free marketplace of ideas then. you couldn't get your views into any of those places unless you owned them. As the head of the ACLU, I had a much better chance of getting a letter published if I sent a letter to the editor of the Times than my father did, who was a construction worker, or than any ordinary person out there would. So there was no free marketplace of ideas. The marketplace of ideas was rigidly controlled by a handful of corporate interests. And the average person could no more get onto that stage platform. He could speak, had the right to speak, but no one heard him.
Right.
So the internet and the social media which followed democratized speech, created a real marketplace of ideas and views that hadn't existed before. And guess what? A lot of ugly stuff crawled out from underneath the rocks.
Shocker. Yeah.
And this isn't new. Those people, who say all those hateful things and who came out to vote for Trump, and they were always there.
Right.
But they were never visible, they were never audible, and they were never connected to people like them in other parts of the country. And so what the internet has really done is it's enabled speech. And guess what? We found out there was a lot of bad speech out there. Now, I always knew that because of our clients. I used to joke that 90% of the people we represented were people I wouldn't want to take home and have dinner with. It was, those views are out there. Democracy can be a dangerous thing. That's why we have a Bill of Rights, to constrain democracy, to limit the power that democracy and democratically elected officials have over people who are constantly outvoted. So the internet and the social media has now made explicit what has always been a problem. And it's hard. We're only at the beginning of thinking this through. You have to have some historical perspective on this. In the 15th century, when the printing press was first invented, the same sort of thing happened. All of a sudden, anybody who had a printing press could publish a leaflet and distribute it to thousands of people, which was impossible before.
And create societal unrest. I mean, that's
right.
Martin Luther's 98 Theses. It's
exactly right.
Changed the whole fabric of Europe.
And the first instinct of both the church and the government was to ban it and to license it and to restrict it. And the same kind of thing that is going on now with respect to Twitter and Facebook went on then with respect to the printing press. And so in England, they passed laws that required there to only be a certain number of printing presses. You couldn't have as many as you could manufacture. You could only have a certain number. And people who used the printing press to put out leaflets of stuff about the government or about the church had to get a license from the government to do so. And that license could be revoked if they didn't like what the printing press was saying. And not only could the license be revoked, but people had to submit what they wanted to publish to the government before they were allowed to publish it. And that problem took hundreds of years to resolve. When the First Amendment is passed in the United States in 1791, you're talking about almost 300 years after the printing press was invented. And there still were no adequate protections for free speech. And even after the First Amendment was passed in 1791, it was only a few years later that America passed a Sedition Act, which made it a crime to criticize the president. And people went to jail in America under that law for criticizing President John Adams at the time, including editors of newspapers and including a member of Congress. So, to reach the point where we are at now, where most people have the right to say what they think and have the right to have it heard by a significant audience, has taken 500 years. And so the idea that we're going to work out these new wrinkles of First Amendment problems with Twitter and Facebook in the space of a few decades, or even is naive.
That sounds silly when you put it in that context, I have to say. Thank you for that historical lesson too. That's really good. As a member
takes time, it just takes time, and it takes time for people to work it through and figure out, well, what is what is.
Absolutely.
No, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I'm sensitive to the fact that Nico has to go in a minute, and I just want to talk a little bit about sort of where some of these arguments take us, right? So FIRE, your organization, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, you defend and sustain individual rights, students and faculty members on college campuses, including freedom of speech, freedom of expression, due process, legal equality, religious liberty. And so I want to ask, I know you got to go because you're bringing a lawsuit. And so I'm interested in some of the litigation that's going on. And I have to say, specifically as a member of the LGBTQ community, I'm always mindful of, I think it was Justice Ginsburg, Oliver Shalom, who said, like, your right to punch ends at my face. Is there a place where we say, okay, your religious liberty ends when it discriminates against me? How do you see that, or how does FIRE see that?
Well, we haven't had very many cases on that score. I think the closest we might get is CLS v. Martinez in, what was that, 2010, involving religious student groups and statements of belief, some of which implicated, sexual minorities. I mean, our belief is, as we've discussed throughout this entire conversation, is that people have a right to speak out and to associate around shared sets of beliefs. Sometimes, unfortunately, those shared sets of beliefs are abhorrent or hateful, or might even be discriminatory. But as long as it falls short of conduct, they have the right to believe and say those things. And one of our greatest advocates and supporters is Jonathan Rauch, who wrote a book called Kindly Inquisitors, and is one of the great historians of the role that free speech played in allowing the LGBT community to have its voice early on. And he discusses Frank Kameny, who was a worker in I believe the Postal Service, or maybe it was like some sort of map service or something. And he was fired from his role in the government for being gay, and spent the rest of his life as an advocate for gay rights. And, at that point, he had very few rights. The only right he had was the First Amendment. And so, we understand, just like we do in the case of Holocaust survivors, the pain that some of the speech can cause. But limiting it because of that pain only opens the door to further censorship and to restrict the rights that at some point you might again need the next time someone is in power with whom you disagree with, and who seeks to take away those rights, whether it's Donald Trump or Joseph Biden. I call it the politics of expediency, the getting away or the throwing away of your rights for a short-term outcome, which will create long-term consequences.
Sure.
Well, and I just also kind of end on a note, and the theme of the film, which was Ira's friendship with Ben Stern and William F. Buckley, is like one of the best ways to change people's minds is to show them your humanity. As Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high, and to engage with people with whom you disagree. It was Abraham Lincoln who asked, do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends? By leading by example, by not shutting down or shutting out someone because you disagree with them. There's this anti-extremist activist, Majid Nawaz, who was an Islamist extremist, on the verge of terrorist, who was jailed at one point. And he shed his beliefs after Amnesty International came to his defense, his due process defense, And he said, this tells me something about liberal democratic values that I never understood before, that people with whom I vehemently disagree and would kill if I had the opportunity will come to my defense on principle. Yeah, don't be afraid, to use the force of your example to change people's minds. And, I don't know how often that happened with Ira and Buckley, but, people aren't without redemption. And we could get into a whole discussion of cancel culture, but I'm weary of the excesses of cancel culture and how they don't create room for redemption in American society anymore. You are the villain and you will always be the villain. And oh, by the way, you can't earn a living anymore. I think has great consequences for the marketplace of ideas and American values writ large.
Well, and I think you bring up the famous quote of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the documentary, The Dissenting Opinion, in the Schwimmer case, where he said that if there's any principle of the Constitution that more imperatively calls for attachment than any other, it's the principle of free thought, not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate. And that's I know it's a tough thing for a lot of folks to stomach. Certainly some folks in the Jewish community think that, the Holocaust is, sui generis, it's on its own. It's not like any other event. We certainly understand the point that the documentary makes, which is that it's, that you can't start drawing the line. Don't start drawing the line. You can't draw the line for anything, because then it's going to be drawn for so many of us, and we'll be on the other side of it. I know, Ira, you had said sort of the key phrase is, does it incite violence? And that's food for thought for a lot of us, right? Because there is some speech, as we've seen, that does incite violence. And so just, you ask a lot of great questions in this documentary. And again, just the way that the stories are told. You're so right, Nico, that a lot of the best work that can be done to change hearts and minds is one-on-one. We've certainly seen that in the LGBT community, just telling our stories, living our truths. So I want to thank you both. The film Mighty Ira is just a fantastic piece of work. Nico, your So to Speak podcast also is really wonderful, and I commend that to folks. For folks who are Bill of Rights nerds, there's a really great new series that's narrated by Will Smith on Netflix called Amend. That's about the 14th Amendment, and it's fantastic. It's really, really great. Have either of you guys seen it yet?
I haven't even heard of it, so thanks.
Oh, yeah, Amend.
Check it out.
Yeah, check it out. It's really great. Hopefully we're doing not much more than watching Netflix these days as we quarantine still. So, Ira, any last thoughts before I say thank you?
Too many.
Too many.
So I'll just say you're welcome. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you to Ira Glasser, the star of Mighty Ira, and to Nico Perrino, the director and producer. Once again, thank you to all of our members and our sponsors, our community partners, our volunteers, all of you film lovers, and especially to our presenting sponsor, SAGE, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout all of these years. Thank you to our audience for participating in the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival. Thank you both.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely.